Okay, but I will say that before I jump into manage stakeholder engagement, I wanted to show you a couple of the tools in planned stakeholder engagement that we just talked about. So remember we talked about the data representation. So here's a common stakeholder engagement plan that would show the levels I mentioned: unaware, resistant stakeholders, neutral, supportive stakeholders, or leading stakeholders. And I can categorize them on the right as my current engagement and the desired engagement. Where do I want to move them to? So you can see I list a few of the people in the company. This list could be as long as my stakeholder list. The CEO is aware of the project, supports it. That's the current state. I'd like to get them to leading, to be a cheerleader for it. So I will work on that. The VP of Ops, the current state is leading because this was a project that they initiated and they're very excited about it. The VP of Marketing also sees future potential for growth in sales, so they support. The VP for Delivery currently is resistant. They see it as potentially a supply chain issue, and maybe I took some money from their budget to form this project, so they're resistant. I want to move them. I'm going to work on my stakeholder engagement to get them to supporting. I don't have to get them all the way to leading, but at least to supporting. That's desired. And finance, the person in finance, they are currently resistant. They didn't see the money and they saw the priorities elsewhere. I'm aware of that. I don't need them to support the project. What I need to do is get the desired engagement to at least neutral, and then I would be happy. Because the opinions of stakeholders can shape your project and influence others. Okay? This is an example I mentioned in data representation in the previous lesson of mind mapping. So the company said, hey, we need to innovate, so that becomes the central concept in the middle of the slide. How am I going to do that? Well, I can do it through creativity, through intellectual property, basic concepts, and economic thought. So in economic thought, I'm going to think of Adam Smith, John Stewart, Karl Marx. These are people that were thinkers in economics, like them or not, and etc. And you can keep growing from there, and it's a map of tying like items back to your central idea, in this case, which is innovation. Okay, also I like this slide just to show you the important stakeholder questions that I use to fill in during an assessment with them. I want to know what motivates them. Do they have financial interests, as I just mentioned, because maybe part of the budget was moved out of one group and into my group for this project? What is their opinion of the work? Is the information they have that form that opinion good information? Who else influences their opinion? So there may be a mid-level director, generally not very powerful, but they may be old academy buddies or Citadel grads with the CEO. So they may golf with them on a regular basis. That becomes someone I want to influence their opinion because they have access to the CEO. And then this is just a whole bunch of other questions you could ask yourself to form a really solid stakeholder engagement plan to understand what influences them, their desires, their goals, their needs, etc. Okay. Now I'm moving on to manage the stakeholder engagement. And in manage stakeholder engagement, I am on page 523 of the PMBOK guide. Manage stakeholder engagement is a process of communicating. So here we are again. We're talking about stakeholders, but what did I just say? Notice in highlight, in bold, the process of communicating and working with stakeholders. So communication and stakeholder management are tied hand in hand. Hard to separate. I'm not sure why we would try. As I mentioned, previous versions of the PMBOK guide version 4, actually had both stakeholder management and stakeholder issues and communications in the very same chapter. I see the benefit of that. I also see the benefit of pulling it apart so that we can concentrate on them as individual disciplines, but just realize so much so that they belong together. And we want to work to increase support of stakeholders and minimize resistance throughout the project. And so the PMBOK guide says, look, we can do that with these inputs, tools, and outputs that you see, because managing stakeholder engagement is going to help ensure stakeholders clearly understand our goals, our objectives, the benefits of the project, and of course the risks as we seek their advice and get their support. Okay? So the inputs include the project management plan. Again, consider the communications. So in the test, if they ask you, input is the project management plan, what are some examples? It would be the communications management plan. What about the stakeholder engagement plan, which was the previous process we just covered? That feeds into this managed stakeholder engagement process. And whenever I have stakeholders, they're going to come up with potential changes. So change plans make sense. Project documents, I always like to emphasize lessons learned, issues log, change log. But in this case, the documents would include, think of a document we just did in the very first process, identify stakeholders. What process, what product did we do? The stakeholder register. That was the output to the process, identify stakeholders. I'm going to get a stakeholder list or a stakeholder register. So all stakeholders, all are stakeholder related. All of these issues log, those come from stakeholders, right? So it makes sense. Now, under tools then, expert judgment, remember individuals or groups with a specialized knowledge. Communication skills is another tool. What about, examples of that would be formal and informal conversations. Identification of issues and reports, meetings. What about progress reports? The whole point to communication is to produce reports. And I could also do surveys. So basically communication, conversations, and reports focus that. I also have to have good interpersonal and team skills as a project manager. I'm going to have conflict. I must resolve it in a timely manner. I always say, let it resolve itself. If I don't have to get involved, if it's not impacting the project, people need to work through issues together. I could encourage it, enhance it, support it, but I don't always have to drive the answer, but it's being aware and knowing what it impacts the team. I have to have a cultural awareness. I have to be able to negotiate. Negotiation is used to achieve support and resolve conflicts also. I'm going to do observations and frankly be politically aware. Politics matters. Understanding the power relationships. There are ground rules that the project team is going to start. So we have the project charter, which is formally signed by the sponsor. But now I'm talking about the team charter. There is the term, and be aware for the new test, this was not on the old ones, but there's a concept of a team charter, and by there we write out the ground rules. How we're going to respond to each other, about courtesy, about respect, about dignity. When I send an email, I expect an email within 24 hours, clock hours, or maybe 10 business hours, things like that. And so it's a way of defining acceptable behavior. And then my outputs. If I'm engaging stakeholders, I expect changes. And this is a result of managing stakeholder engagement. I expect changes. And then, of course, I'm going to have updates to the project plan, including, guess what? Right, the communications plan and the stakeholder engagement plan. And now, under project management plan updates, notice any change to the plan goes through what? Any change to the project management plan must go through what process? Ready? Integrated Change Control, hopefully, or ICC. Hopefully you've got that by now. And then my final output are project document updates. I'm always thinking my change log, issues log, lessons learned register. Again, what's a register? Just a list. So this time it's a list of lessons learned. And then my stakeholder register, because look what process I'm in. Manage stakeholder engagement. So that makes perfectly good sense to me. Okay, that should do it for this. Let's take a quick break and come back.